Bass Pro Shops Outdoor World Library, presented by today's foremost professional sportsmen, who will share proven methods and techniques that will help you become a better and more successful fisherman.
Hi, I'm Grigsby. In this edition of Bass Pro Shops Outdoor World Library, I'm going to teach you about crankbait fishing. We're going to go over the equipment, the bait selections, and a few techniques that will help you catch some really big fish. First, let's talk about what is a crankbait. Generally, when you look at a crankbait, you see a basic fish-type body and a lip on it. The lip facilitates its diving into the water. There's two types of crankbaits: a deep diving crankbait and a shallow diving crankbait. Most of them, the deep divers, have real big lips, and the shallow divers have real small lips. Also, there's some other crankbaits that are not just underwater baits, but they sit on top, and as you pull them, they'll dive under and then return to the surface. They're still crankbaits. Some of these are referred to, like this particular bait, as a jerk bait. Then you have the lipless crankbaits, as seen here. These don't have a lip, but the slope of the body of the bait allows for the action of the bait. These baits, when they hit the water, generally will sink, and you can retrieve them at any depth that you prefer to, depending on your retrieve. One other thing, there's two main compositions of crankbaits: either wood or plastic. Plastic baits tend to make a little bit more sound. They have rattles in them. Most baits do have sound chambers. And they're generally a little heavier and they're a little easier to throw than wood baits. However, wood baits nowadays are becoming weighted. They have weights in them, and they're able to throw a long distance also, like this new long cast crankbait here. So you don't have the casting problems with the wood bait anymore that we used to. Wood baits tend to have a larger wobble and catch a lot more, or put in a lot more action into the bait to catch more fish. When fish are a little bit finicky, a tighter wobble sometimes will catch fish, so the plastic baits will come in handy on those days. Traditionally, wood baits are silent baits. They don't have any sound chambers, although you can find some that are manufactured that have sound chambers in them. Wood baits, to me, tend to be extremely effective in clear water. If you have muddy or stained water, a bait that has a sound chamber or has rattles in it will catch you a lot of fish. The fish will then use its lateral lines to detect the vibration and the sound waves and key in on the bait to catch it. In clear water, the fish tend to feed predominantly on sight or by sight. And if they're feeding predominantly by sight, then a wood body bait tends to catch more fish that way because of the nice wobble, the wide wobble of the bait, and it's silent. For some reason, I found that the more rattles that you have in a bait in clear water, you don't tend to catch as many fish. So the quieter bait you have in clear water, the more fish you seem to catch. Let's talk about colors. If you go to a tackle store like Bass Pro Shops and you walk in there, they have walls and walls of crankbaits. Different colors, different sizes. It's mind-boggling. You don't know where to start or how to choose a bait. Well, let's start off with color. There's really three main colors that you want, or color types that you want to have. The first one being a shad color. Basic shad colors are either pearl with a black back, they're natural shads, they're chrome colors. Those are shad colors. They're representing a shad that's, a threadfin shad or some type of shad that's in the water that the bass is feeding on. Those are your shad colors. Your next color choice is a crawfish, which is another primary food source of the bass. These are some of your crawfish patterns. This would be a regular crawfish, and another good crawfish pattern with an orange belly. This one has a little chartreuse on it. Both of these are excellent crawfish patterns. And the third color combination would be like your perch colors, which would be for your panfish, which is another food source, which are your chartreuse colors. They're greenish, bluish. These all would fall in the perch colors. So if you're getting crankbaits, try to get something with these three major color sources. There's one other that I don't talk about a whole lot. Bass are predators and they are cannibalistic. They do eat their own young at times, and a baby bass color can be quite effective at times. One thing that you can do, and you're going to be throwing these baits into heavy cover or around heavy cover, ledges, rocks, trees, bushes. Fish are structure-oriented, cover-oriented, and the bass are, and that's what we're going to try to fish for. So if you're going to throw them around this cover, you're bound to lose a few. So definitely buy quite a few of your favorite colors, of these particular colors. And then if you break one off, then you still have another bait to keep staying out there and catching those big ones. Once you've purchased a few color crankbaits, the next thing is determining the size. And to determine the size is really the time of year you're fishing. If you fish in the springtime, you probably want a smaller crankbait because the shad and even the crawfish, they're generally a little smaller at that time. They're just starting to grow, and so I'll choose a smaller crankbait. Now they make small crankbaits with big lips, deep lips and shallow lips. So what you want is, depending on the lake you're fishing, you want to have either a deep runner or a shallow runner. Now I found in the springtime we generally have a lot of rains, and so the water tends to muddy up a bit, and a bright color like a chartreuse color crankbait seems to work real well for me in a small size with a shallow lip. If the water's a little stained or muddy, fish will tend to come up shallower, so you can catch more fish that way. The other thing you want to look at is if once it turns to summertime, the shad have started to grow rather large, so you move up in size, getting a larger crankbait. See the difference between a small crankbait that you can run in the springtime and a large crankbait that you'll run in the summertime. And towards the fall, they'll have actually just reached their growing cycle, and actually when the winter starts coming, it starts killing the shad, and you can still use these large crankbaits. And what I tend to do is take a large crankbait that has a shallower lip, because the fish tend to move up in the shallows again in the fall. So if you look at it in that sense, you have a small crankbait, either shallow or deep runner depending on your lake in the springtime, a large crankbait in the summertime, and a large crankbait generally with a shallow lip for the fall. Those tend to work very well for me. So actually all we're trying to do is match the size of the bait to the forage that the bass are feeding on. Let's get into the lipless crankbaits. These are the shaddlacks, rattle traps. There's a variety of different kinds of them. These baits tend to be fantastic fish catchers all year round. They're extremely versatile. They sink, so you can reel them in real shallow water or real deep water, depending on your retrieve speed. When I'm in a tournament, I always have one of these tied on one of my rods. Speaking of rods, let's go to equipment. In fishing, just like in the game of golf, or if you're a mechanic and you have tools. In golf, you have your clubs. In fishing, we have rods and reels. Every rod does a different task. Every reel does a different task. Let's say with this lipless crankbait. A real important factor, and these generally go for all your crankbaits. With a lipless crankbait, I prefer a high-speed reel. Therefore, I can fluctuate the retrieve speed, either real fast or real slow, at my discretion. Just by turning the handle, gives me a real high speed. If I use, let's say, a real low-speed reel, then I wouldn't be able to buzz this on top and keep it above, let's say, hydrilla or some type of grass, underwater grass, in, let's say, a foot of water, where with a high-speed reel I can do that. So I like a high-speed reel. Let's talk about the rod. If you read a lot of articles in any of the fishing magazines, you've read about using fiberglass rods for reaction baits, such as crankbaits. Graphite rods are an excellent rod also, but the real key factor is getting one with a real light tip. The lighter the tip, the better the rod will be, up to a point. What I've found is that I don't tend to miss the fish or lose the fish, even with graphite, as long as I'm using these light actions. This particular rod's a medium light, so it has a real flexible tip. Another thing you want to look at is the length of the rod. Generally, when we're throwing crankbaits, we like to make long casts. If you have a short rod, you just can't make a very long cast, so we tend to have a longer rod for crankbait fishing. This particular one's a 7-foot rod. Like I said, it's a medium light action. As we're fishing these baits, and hopefully we'll fight a few fish in, we'll show you the tip action of the rod and how light it is. What a fish does when he comes up to eat these baits is he's going to either track the bait and strike, or he'll just rush up and strike it. But when they eat the bait, they flare their gills, open their mouth, and it creates a huge suction for this bait to just fly back in their mouth. If you have a real stiff rod, then that amount of suction that he's using, that he's creating, will only end up catching him right around the edges of the lips, where if you have a real limber rod, that rod will give with the suction of the bass and allow the bass to take this bait in much deeper, and that way you'll catch a few more of the fish. If I'm using a bait like a deep diving crankbait, we'll go from one extreme to the other. Shallow running crankbaits or lipless crankbaits, a high speed reel. A deep diving crankbait, I'll use what's called a cranking reel. Now the real deep diving crankbaits, these are the ones that are going 12 to 15 to sometimes they're over 20 feet deep nowadays. You want a reel that gets that bait down deep. If you used a high-speed reel for this, what happens is as your bait tracks in the water and it's running in the water flow is over this lip is facilitating the dive. That's what's creating the depth of the bait, is as the water flows over this lip and falls off on the sides. If you reel it too fast, the water flows over and you don't get the depth. If you reel it real slow, then you can get the depth. What they've come up with is a reel that's just designed for throwing these big heavy crankbaits. It's called a cranking reel, and it's a 3.8 to 1 retrieve ratio, which is about the best speed for those big heavy crankbaits. They've proved that these reels can get the baits deeper than any of the rest of the reels. What happens is you tend to over-reel them on any other speed reel. The same rod I use for these baits is a nice light action, light tipped rod. Then for your general all-purpose everyday cranking, whether I'm using the little shallow crankbaits or some of the plastic baits and the medium runners and just the mid-depth baits, I generally like just a medium speed retrieve reel. This particular one's a 4.4 to 1. You can use them from anywhere from 4.4 up to 5.1. Any of those retrieve ratios will work well for the regular crankbaits, because then you're not as interested in how deep you can get it or how fast you can go. It's just you want a nice smooth reel that'll give you a good cranking speed. Another thing you want to look at is that if you throw these big heavy deep diving crankbaits, they're very hard to retrieve anyway. When you go down in retrieve ratio like this to a 3.8 to 1, these are like a little winch. The reel turns into a real powerful machine now. So if you use, let's say, a 5 to 1 or a 6 to 1, they're rather hard to retrieve in, whereas if you go down to this reel, you don't even notice it. And that means you have much more sensitivity for feeling that big fish hit the bait. Some of these baits, like I said, will dive down in the 20-foot range and can be very hard to retrieve if you don't have a good reel. Once you've picked out your rod and reel, you need to put some good line on it. I prefer a clear line in generally the 10, 12, or 14-pound test category. One thing about fishing crankbaits is that you're always fishing them in structure, around heavy structure, cover, rocks, ledges, logs, stumps, and because of that you need a line that's going to be tough and hold up under the severe abrasion that you can receive. The nature of a crankbait is it's going to dive down to the bottom. As the bait dives down, the water flows over the lip and falls off on each side. As it does that, that gives it its depth. If you pull it too fast, it just flows right off of it and you basically pull it flat whereas if you pull it slowly, it's allowed to dive, and preferably you're going to be bumping along the bottom. Well, the line is preceding that, so any stumps or rocks or anything that's down there, that line rubs over it first, so you need to have a good line that has excellent abrasion resistance. How do I choose the right pound test line for my fishing conditions? Well, let's look at that. Deep diving crankbaits, they're fairly heavy anyway, so you need a fairly strong line. If you're fishing an open-bodied lake with not a lot of structure or limbs or logs, you can probably fish 10 or 8 pound test line. But if you have limbs and trees that you're bumping bottom in, then you need to be going up to 12 or 14. I've even used 17 pound test line in some real heavy cover situations. But just for an all-around purposes, 12 pound test line will fish just about everywhere that you need to fish. When fishing lipless crankbaits, and really any crankbaits, these rules generally apply. The smaller the line, the deeper the bait will go. Sometimes I've had to break the rules. In one situation, I remember using a crankbait, a rattle trap bait, and trying to throw it over grass, hydrilla, that had come within about 6 or 8 inches of the surface. And the only way I could get it in, even with a high-speed reel, was to go to 25 pound test line. The line would keep the bait from sinking. It would basically float the bait, so I could reel it in real fast right across the top and catch a lot of fish that way. So don't always stick with your general rules of saying, 8 or 10 or 12 or 14 pound test line is what I want to use. Sometimes you have to go way high, sometimes you need to go way low. If I want to take a deep diving crankbait and get it down into 20 feet of water, then I'll probably have to downsize my line to, let's say, 10 or 8. The small diameter cuts through the water easier, has less drag, less resistance, and allow the bait to go deeper. A basic rule on the pound test line and the crankbait you're using is, if it's heavy cover, you want to use a little heavier line, and if it's light cover or very little cover, you can go down in size line, so you can go down to 10. Most of my line size, though, that I use, like I said, was 10, 12, and 14. 12 being my predominant line size. Another tip, if you're fishing real clear water, crystal clear water where you can see the bottom in 5, 8, 10 feet of water, sometimes even 30 feet of water, sometimes you'll want to go down in size, so you want to go down to 8 pound test line cranking, or maybe even 6 if you need to. And another tip is to go to an ultra clear line, a real ultra clear monofilament. They make some very high quality brands that are out right now that can get your baits deeper because they're real small diameter and ultra clear. A lot of times when you buy a crankbait, it comes with hooks that sometimes I don't feel are that desirable. I tend to change my hooks from some of the small gap hooks like this to a wide gap, wide bend hook. A wide gap hook tends to have a better bite when the fish inhales it. You can get a little bit better bite in him, and therefore you can land him a lot better. So I tend to change the hooks. A lot of the manufacturers are sending their baits out now with the wide gap hook because it's so popular. To change a hook, it's real simple. You can buy them at most stores. Just take them and take the split ring, spread it apart with your fingernail or spread it apart with a pair of pliers, and just slide one on and one off. It's a very fast process. It takes just a few seconds. Once you change the hooks, the next thing you want to do also is to sharpen them. Ever since I started fishing, we always carried files with us, and we'd file the hook and sharpen it this way and that way and get them razor sharp, what we called. And until quite a few years ago, I thought that was the best way to sharpen them. But since then, I've learned that the absolute best penetration you can get for a hook is a needle point. So you want a round point. It's the best penetration you can get. If you put angles and edges on it, what that does is that tears. That will actually cut when it penetrates into the fish's mouth. If it's a little piece of skin and it cuts it, it tears it, it's a bigger hole. A bigger hole means he can get rid of that hook just as easy as he got on it. So we sharpen them with one of my favorite tools, which is called a hook honer. It's the only sharpener that I know of that can make a round needle point. It's a real simple tool, and I take every single hook and I use this. I sharpen every hook on the bait All you do is insert the hook into the top of it and push the button. Noisy little critter, isn't it? In about 3 seconds, you have that hook razor sharp. That's so important because sometimes these fish are feeding lightly, they're not real aggressive, they'll come up and they'll nip the bait. Well, if they just touch this hook, it sticks them. And that's all you need. The light tip then on the rod will give, it'll facilitate you just reeling that fish in nice and slow and working him in, and you can land a fish that just barely touches him. When I sharpen my hooks in a tournament, they're so sharp that if it's laying in my hand and I go to pick it up, one of the hooks will stick. It'll always, you can't even touch them, it's real tacky. So it just sticks in every little hook will be razor sharp. And using this product can do that very simply. One of the most important things in crankbait fishing is your knot. If you don't have a good knot, you're not going to get the proper wobble out of the crankbait, the proper performance, and you won't be catching the fish. The first thing I do is take the split ring off. Now you don't have to do this. They'll work fine with the split rings, but because each split ring has a little point on each end, I think you can lose some fish sometimes by the line being cut there. So I take them off and tie directly to the eye of the bait. The knot's called a king sling. To tie the king sling, you insert the line through the eye and get about 18 inches of line. Then just grab it in the middle and swing the bait around. You wrap it 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Once you've done that, you take the bait and drop it through the loop. An important step is to lock this loop behind the eye. I've put my finger on the eye to lock the loop behind the eye. Then you'll see the line turn to a figure 8. Just slide it down to where it gets small, pop it off the back of the eye, tighten it up. Then I just trim the end, and there's my knot. A real nice loop, extremely loose, gives the bait the most action that you can possibly get. If you decide to leave the split ring on a bait and not tie the king sling knot, the knot you want to use is called the Palomar knot. To tie that, just double your line, get about the same 18 inches of line, double it, slide it through the split ring or the eye of the bait, and just tie a simple overhand knot. So just loop it once, stick the end through, and you've got an overhand knot. Then, very similar to the king sling, just drop your bait through the loop, and most people at this point cinch it up. Well, don't do that. Just tighten it up, allow this loop to flop over on top, like that, and then it'll cinch down. At any point, you can wet the line if you like or whatever, but once you allow that loop to slip over, to flop over on top, you have a super strong knot. Then just trim the end, and we're ready to go fishing. One thing you need to know about a crankbait rod is to make sure it has a long handle. As you can tell, I've got this handle rested against my side. It just makes it real comfortable for reeling these big crankbaits in. It'll also give you a longer cast because you can take it with 2 hands and really let the tip and the rod work for you and make a real long cast. So make sure you have a decent handle on it. And this one's about 11 or 12 inches long, maybe even 13, and that'll work real well. You can just rest it and stay comfortable so you can crankbait all day long. Let's go over a few of the best retrieves for fishing a crankbait. The first one is a steady retrieve. Everybody knows how to do this one. You just throw it out and reel it in. The speed of the retrieve you can vary. If you like, you could reel it fast or you can reel it slow, but a steady retrieve means you're doing it the same all the way in. That's the way most people fish a crankbait, and a lot of times you can catch fish that way. One of my favorites is called the stop and go. The way you fish the stop and go is you make your cast and you reel it down. Then sometime, and usually 3 or 4, maybe even 5 times during your retrieve, you just stop the bait. Just reel it, just stop cranking the reel. Let that bait float up. What'll happen is as you bring the bait in, this bait will be tracking through the water and it's wobbling through the water. When you stop it, It'll stop and hesitate a minute and then start to float up backwards. A lot of times the fish will track that bait, be right behind it, and as soon as it stops, it's kind of floating up in front of his face and he just flares on it and eats it. Excellent way to catch a fish. So just bring the bait down at a good steady retrieve, then slow it down, and every now and then just stop it. And the amount of time that you want to hesitate that bait is very small amount. Just hesitate it for less than a second, or about 1 second. And that gives the bait just enough time to start to rise. One of the third retrieve, and this is another one that really produces a lot of strikes, is a jerking retrieve. It's very similar to the stop and go, but you're going to jerk the bait instead of stopping it. So you make your cast, reel the bait down, and then just jerk the bait. Take about 5 or 6 or 10 cranks in between and just jerk it and pull it to you. And feel that bait when you do that. And what that does is the bait's swimming along again, and then all of a sudden it speeds up. It makes it real erratic. The bait will be swimming along and it just speeds up and jerks real quick. And that means the fish is sitting there, all of a sudden it's like it's getting away from him, and he'll react real quick and run out there and just grab the bait. So that's another one of my favorite retrieves. Again, the jerk. Just reel it down, pull it. Super way to catch a big fish. The fourth retrieve that you really need to master is called the crawl. And you've heard so much and read, I'm sure, plenty of articles and probably seen other videos on fishing spinnerbaits, slow rolling a spinnerbait. Well, it's about the same retrieve for a crankbait. It's called the crawl. Now with the crawl, you want to get the bait down to the bottom, so you reel it down, get it down to the bottom or get it to its maximum depth, and then just slow it down and reel it real slow. It's called the crawl. I've won a lot of money on the crawl. Just work the bait real slow. Now this is one of these slow speed retrieves, a 381 reel. So when you crawl it, depending on your reel, the ratio that you have, the retrieve ratio, is depending on how fast you want to turn that handle. But you want to be able to feel that lip just slow wobbling down there at the bottom. So you'll feel the vibrations as it just shaking down there, just woof, 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 woof. You feel that crankbait digging in the bottom. Oh, that's a deadly retrieve. Thought I just had a bite right there. Let's go over those real quick one more time. The first retrieve is your steady retrieve, just a steady crank in. Whether it's fast, slow, or in between, a steady retrieve. Your next retrieve was your stop and go. You make your cast, reel it down, hopefully you're bumping the bottom, get into the bottom, and stop it. Just hesitate it. Just watch your reel and just hesitate the retrieve. Usually right when you hesitate it, you'll feel that line snap, and that's when he hits it. The third retrieve was your jerking retrieve. So you want to throw it out, reel it down, and then pull it. Give it a pretty good jerk. Ooh, I was just hitting the bottom. Boy, when it hits the bottom, it always gets you excited. So that's your third retrieve, and the fourth being the crawl. Reel it down fairly quickly, and then slow it down to just a slow crawl, and just work it right through the cover. The crawl is also an excellent retrieve for in heavy cover. Because of the way the lip works, the action of the bait, it'll actually crawl over the branches and crawl through the cover without getting hung up. A good tip for fishing a crankbait is make sure your drag is relatively loose. To check your drag and adjust your drag, what most people do is just reach down here and just kind of pull it out. So yeah, that's about right. But when you think about it, you have so much resistance through your rod down to the bait that there's a lot more drag than what you're feeling right here. There's a lot more. If you take it right there and adjust it and then you try to pull, there's no drag release. So what you want to do is adjust it from out here. Either take the bait and hook it onto an object and then adjust the drag to where, you know, when you're fighting it, that the drag gives a little. With about 3 pounds of pressure. You want a good 2.5 or 3 pound fish to be able to start to pull drag. If he's bigger than that, then you definitely want him to pull drag. You want to make sure these little hooks, as you notice, they don't have but maybe a 1/2 inch bite in the hook. And some of them have down to little itty bitty hooks on them that have very little bite. And so you want to make sure that that hook does not pull out of his mouth. So you adjust your drag to where you can just tighten up and pull it out. Let the rod tip work for you. Generally, once you've done it 1 or 2 times by hooking it onto an object, then you know the feel that you want and you can adjust it without having to do that. What we're fishing right here is just a basic ledge, and it's real similar to fishing a creek channel. Ledges, creek channels, basic drops. How you want to fish these, with the ledge, I'm staying out deep right now. I'm in 15 to 18, sometimes even 20 feet of water. And I'm throwing up over here into about 3 or 4 feet, maybe even 5 feet. It's real shallow water, and then it drops straight down. And that's real similar to fishing a flat with a creek channel running through it. It's the same type of fishing. The only difference in fishing a creek channel and fishing this ledge is fishing a creek channel, you'd probably stay up on one side of the creek channel in shallow water and do exactly what I'm doing. I watch my depth finder here. I'll be in 5 to 7, I'll swing it out, and I'll be in 10 or 15, and I'll swing it back in, so I make sure I'm staying on the break, right on the break. Now on a creek channel, I'll stay in the shallow, and every now and then make sure I'm still in the creek channel by swinging my depth finder, swinging my boat around with the trolling motor, make sure I'm in the shallow water, and then right on the edge of the deep. With the ledge, I'm going to stay right in the deep, and just every now and then make sure I'm right on the edge of it, so I can keep bringing it right down the edge. So the main ways of fishing this is a slight parallel. You're not really paralleling it. You're throwing down the edge, kind of coming across it at a slight 45-degree angle or so. Ooh, well, I thought I had one right there. And that seems to be the most productive. Just throwing off maybe to 45. I'm back down to like 20 feet here. And you can swing your boat just a little bit here, and all of a sudden you notice you're right on the edge. It just comes right back up. So you know you're bumping your crankbait right down the ledge. The real important thing here, remember when I was talking about structure fishing and fishing some points, keep a buoy marker, because you never know when you're going down a ledge or the creek channel when you're going to hit those stumps or hit those spots that are really concentrated and holding a big school of fish. That's one thing about structure fishing and crankbait fishing, is you're real liable to hit those big schools and catch 4, 5, 6, sometimes 10 or 15 fish in one spot. So keep that buoy marker handy. Again, try your different retrieves. You know, you crank it down, try slow cranking, the crawl. And try the stop and go. And just keep varying your technique as you go down the ledge. The creek channel side of the same fishing here has caught me a lot of fish in tournaments, and I've made some good checks in tournaments fishing creek channels. Once the spawn is over in about March or April or May, depending on where you live, sometimes it's June, these fish like pulling off just off into the deep water in the creeks. And creek channel seems to really produce all the way in through into summer and then into fall. And just take your crankbait, throw across the creek channel, work it down one side into the ditch and then back up into the creek channel and back up. And you'll be bumping the sides and bumping the stumps the whole time. Super productive way to catch them. The closer you stay on that drop, the more you can keep the crankbait in the strike zone right down the edge. Just drops right off. And remember, just always, you'll hear me talk about it over and over, bump the bottom. And there he is. Just came right off the lip. Learning the proper techniques of catching these fish. Come on, little fella. He's being sluggish, just staying down there. Sometimes I wonder, well, he's going back up under the boat. Let me work him back out here. There he goes. He's just barely hooked. It's when you have to be real careful with him. Just barely, yeah, see him just barely got it right in the side. And that's what happened. He came right off of that ledge. Ooh, I thought he'd just thrown it. You can, oh, yeah, I love it. What a shot. Come on, fish. You're showing off. He got up here and he said, hey, these guys are filming. I'll show off. Come on, big guy. Always be cautious of those big old hooks. What a fish. Just barely caught it, just right here. That's just, I mean, we're talking last hook, bottom hook, just barely caught it as it came off there. That's the real secret. You get a nice limber tip and the rod will do the rest for you. Don't horse them. If you really start horsing these fish, you're gonna lose a beautiful fish. Full grown one here. Boy, I tell you what, nice little ledge bass. Big ledge bass for me. Fish like that I'd love to catch in a tournament. Make you a lot of money. Well, let's tell you what, we fished some excellent structure here. We fished some ledges and some points. Let's try some shallow water, some grass lines. I'm not sure with these fish and the mode that they're in, staying off here on these edges, whether we'll do very well, but we're sure gonna give it a try. One of the best pieces of structure that you can fish is a point. I've marked this point right here with a little buoy marker in hopes of catching a big fish here. What you do is you ride across it with your graph or your locator or your flasher, whatever you use, until you kind of figure out the configuration of the point. Now this particular one just kind of runs out here off to my right, or my left here. This particular point kind of runs off here to my left. And what the best way I found to fish most points is to cast across the point and reel the bait up and bump the bottom. That way you can hit it at different levels. I've marked it at the very top to where it's at its shallowest part, and I can fan cast out all the way down to the deepest part. Using this long cast DB3, it's going to bump the bottom all the way down to when I get to about 17 or 18 feet of water. Hopefully when I hit the top of that point, that's when I'll get the bite. So I'm going to reel it down, and I'm going to try a few of the varied retrieves. Some of the stop and go, some of the other retrieves like a jerk retrieve, or maybe even the slow crawl. And I'm going to do them at different depths out, trying to figure out exactly at what depth the fish are at. If you ran your chart recorder or your liquid crystal graph or whatever that you're using across the point and you find them at a particular depth, just mark, way up from that depth so that you're not throwing on your marker, and then try to fish exactly where you've marked them. Another good tip, and I use this a lot when I'm fishing grass lines and creek channels where you have a varied contour, what you do is set a buoy marker out and lay it on your deck and open it up, and then when you get a bite, you just kind of kick it overboard, or you can just leave it like I have, leave it laying on the deck, to where if you get a fish, you can throw it overboard and you know where you were, and you can remember exactly the angle that you cast at to get that bite. Another good way to fish a point is coming down the point. Instead of going across it like I am here and bumping the bottom, you can go down it. So you'll throw up shallow, and the buoy marker, like I said, I marked at the very top so I can do this fairly easily. You just change your boat position a little bit. See, I hit the bottom there, got a little bit of grass on it. But then you want to throw up shallow and reel it down the bank, down the slope. Try to stay in contact with the bank the whole time, right with the bottom, let it bump the bottom. Do some stop and go. Maybe try a jerk every now and then. And remember, these retrieves, you can mix them up at all times. You don't have to do just one thing. And especially with fishing in general, being versatile will catch you more fish. So don't get set into doing it just one way. Just feel it bump down the bottom until it comes down and comes off the structure altogether. A lot of times you'll fish a point like this, and you may fish all the way around the point and crisscross it and all, and finally get out there and hit like a stump laying out on the end of it, or a stump on the side of it. And boy, if you get that stump and you hit it, you want to drop a marker so you know right where it is, and fan cast a little more around it, bump it a few more times, because guaranteed there'll be a fish laying on that stump or on whatever structure is around there. On a few cases, when you're fishing in real cold weather, we'll get up shallow and fish up the point, throwing out into the real deep water and working it back up. Like I said, I do that usually in the dead of winter time, or when it's just a real cold front comes in and drives the fish out deep. Then I'll get up shallow and throw out and work it back up real slow. As water temperatures warm after a front or during a front during the day, they'll warm up generally a little bit, and the fish will start to move up, or try to, and therefore you're covering all the way from the deep depths all the way coming up to the shallow depths. But I fish mainly, I'll fish across a point or down a point. Those have always been my best producers. There we go. Whoa, this is gonna be a nicer fish. Oh yeah. Come on, big fella. Here he comes. I started to hit a limb right there. I felt it just tick it. Here he comes. He's gonna come right on up. A lot of times that's what they do is, come on, big fish. Look at it. Oh, here he goes. I love it when they're gonna jump. Come on, big guy. There he goes. You big stud, you. Oh yeah. Just as I hit that limb, he jumped on it. Come on. Well, that's a pretty nice little fish. Get down here and lip him. But I felt it hit a limb. I kind of thought, well, maybe that was a fish, but it wasn't. And then just as it pulled off of it, ah, you big guy, he jumped on it. Boy, he had it too. But that's what you have to do. You have to get it up on the point, bump the bottom, and you can catch some real nice fish deep cranking points. We'll let this one go. Come on, big guy. And we'll go try some other structure real quick and see what else we can do, if we can catch some more fish. We're gonna fish some heavy cover here. Big old trees laying down, and hopefully we'll find a variety of different heavy cover. And what we're gonna use is a shallow running crankbait back on our standard retrieve reel. And I'm gonna show you how to keep it from getting hung up. And you're gonna utilize the lip of the bait to keep you from getting hung up. You can throw it all the way in these trees or down the logs. Like right there, just throw it right down in the logs and work it slow, and use your tip and just work it in nice and slow. If you end up reeling it real fast and crashing into the limbs, a lot of times the bait will end up getting hung right at that point. As you can see, I'm bumping down in it. There's all kinds of junk in these trees. It holds a lot of fish like that. Just throw it right down the line, right into the trees. Just work it. And if you get hung up in some junk, just kind of twitch the bait and pull it loose. Like I said, there's going to be all kinds of heavy grass and limbs and logs. I do a lot of stopping. A lot of this stop and start, and a little bit of pull. I don't usually use the jerk technique in here, and the only reason I don't is because a lot of times you end up jerking it and you'll get hung in the limbs. So you just kind of work on through, just throw all in them, all around them. Another thing you can do instead of casting, a lot of times I found that I can pitch a bait. If you have a real tight little spot, you can take your little crankbait, and on these new reels, in fact this one's called a pitching reel, and it's just a perfect size reel, perfect retrieve ratio for running crankbaits. So what I do is I'll just pitch it into a tight little spot and then just crawl it right up over a limb. When you feel it bump the limb, just kind of pull it on over. A lot of times you would think that that limb would be a strike, but you want to keep these hooks so sharp that you just touch them and they kind of stick to your fingers. And it ends up when that bass hits it, generally he'll get hooked. Now see, I'm right in the limbs here. Just kind of pull it, rock it over it, pull it down, and work through it. Let that lip dig over and flop the bait over on the tree limbs. We'll work on down and try some more of these. And remember, when you're covering a tree, you need to cover, and a lot of times it's better to cover the outside tip first. So hit it right out on the point, work it back, and then work your way in. A lot of times the real big fish may stage right out on the edge of right out on the tip of the tree, and then work your way back into the tree. Some people I know I've seen them fished with, and they'll just throw right in the middle first and then bring it on through. And you never know, that big fish may have been right on the point, and he'll run back in the tree a little bit to bite it, and then you're all hung up with him. So start on the outside and work in. It makes it easier to catch the fish and bring him out once you've hooked him. Now after a little while, if you find out and you've caught a few fish and they're all biting, let's say in the middle of them or right out on the tip, then you know where to throw. You know, you can kind of pattern where they'll be staging on these limbs. Got me some more trash on that. Now it's real hard to keep from the grass being caught up on the bait, but working it, and I'll show you this one, I'll just pitch it into this tree. But working it over the limbs, just crawl it over the limb, and the bait will just kind of flop over the limb and work it on down. Super productive way of catching fish. In fact, this little crankbait right here won me back in the end of 1984, won me $100,000 in a tournament. One tournament for 2 days. And I'd go there and catch a limit on this, throwing it in heavy cover and doing exactly what I'm telling you here. I'd work it through, keep your rod tip up. Now that's another thing, I think I failed to mention that a few minutes ago. Keep your rod tip up, and it allows the angle of the bait, allows the angle of your line and your bait to keep the bait down at a sharp angle, and it'll flop over a lot easier. It also allows for your rod tip to give a little when you hit the limb, and it kind of bounces the bait, which is exactly what you need to get it through the brush. But you'd be surprised how weedless these baits can be if you keep that rod tip up, keep a nice slow even retrieve, and bounce it through the limbs. Now here's a perfect example here of trying to crawl it through the limbs. We throw it back in the tree. Keep your rod tip up, and you'll see it just kind of crawl over the limbs. That just kind of crawls over. You'd be surprised how weedless these baits can be if you just don't force them. Finesse them a little bit and crawl it over the tree. Work it through the limbs, let it bounce over. If it gets hung up momentarily like that, just kind of back off. There it fouled, unfortunately, but just kind of back off and let the lip do the work. These baits are designed like that just to come through this cover. And it's phenomenal what you can catch bouncing it through those. Just like taking a spinnerbait or something, slow rolling it through them, except crankbait sometimes will really outproduce that old spinnerbait. Just bounce it on through the limbs. Whoa, look at there, right off on the tip. Oh, wait a minute, there he is, he came through it. Come on, fish. He just came through the limbs. Just as I got into the limbs, he's on it. Come on, big guy. You got it. Oh, he wants to go out. That's what he wants to do. He said, I'm going on out to the deep water. Heck with this limbs and stuff. Oh, I love it. It's exciting. Golly, crankbaits. Come on, you big guy. Oh, give it up. You're caught. See, now that's the advantage of really sharpening those hooks, is that once they get a hold of it, they're generally done for then. Come on, big fish. Oh yeah. If I can get around. Oh, I like it. I like it. Crankbait fishing, not at its best, but it's mighty fine. I love this stuff. All right, big guy, go grow up. Love these little things. Let's recap some of the finer points here. Remember, match the crankbait to the size of the bait fish that the bass are feeding on in your lake or stream or reservoir. And then make sure you have good quality equipment, a rod with a nice light tip, the reel to do the job. Remember, a low speed reel for the big heavy crankbaits and a high speed reel for the little lipless baits. And then get yourself some good premium monofilament line and you're ready to go fishing. Don't forget your different retrieves. Be versatile. Don't forget your jerk retrieve, your slow speed retrieve. Don't forget any of them. Just utilize them, and hopefully that'll make you a more successful fisherman. I hope somewhere in this video there's been a few of the points that'll really help you catch some more fish. And good luck next time you're out there crankbaiting.
Bass Pro Shops Outdoor World Library, presented by today's foremost professional sportsmen, who will share proven methods and techniques that will help you become a better and more successful fisherman.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and would like to take this opportunity to invite you to visit the Bass Pro Shops National Headquarters in Springfield, Missouri. Outdoor World, with over 150,000 square feet of shopping magic. A showcase for everything found in the Bass Pro catalogs and much more. Waterfalls, restaurants, 5 fresh and saltwater aquariums, endless displays of top-quality hunting gear, and the largest fishing department in the world. Visit the Outdoor World showroom today, and for our latest catalog, call 1-800-BASS-PRO. The catalog's free, and so is the call. Thank you for letting us help you have fun outdoors.